Good evening and welcome to the University of Adelaide for the second Sir John Downer Oration, to be delivered this year by the Prime Minister, the Hon Tony Abbott. I'd first like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, at Waite, at Theberton and Roseworthy are built. My name's Clement McIntyre. I'm a member of the School of History and Politics in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the University, and I'm delighted to be the MC for tonight's address. My first task is to invite our Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Warren Bennington, to say a few words of welcome. Vice-Chancellor.
Thank you, Clem. The Honourable Tony Abbott, Prime Minister of Australia. Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment and Senator for South Australia. Senator Sean Edwards, Senator for South Australia. Senator David Fawcett, Deputy Government Whip in the Senate and Senator for South Australia. Dr Andrew Southcott, the Member for Boothby. Mrs Vicky Chapman, Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Member for Bragg. The Honourable David Ridgway, Shadow Minister for Tourism, Primary Industries, Food and Wine. Sir Eric Neal, former Governor of South Australia. The Honourable John Bannon, former Premier of South Australia. The Honourable John Olsen, former Premier of South Australia. And Deputy Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, Di Davison, members of Council, members of the Downer family, including Lady Downer, Edward, John and Rose Downer, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Vice-Chancellor, it's my great pleasure to officially welcome you this evening to the 2014 Sir John Downer Oration. I particularly want to acknowledge the Downer family, who've contributed so much to our university, to our state and to the Commonwealth. Sir John Downer was, without question, a very notable South Australian. He was a leading barrister in Adelaide before first being elected to the House of Assembly in 1878. Throughout his political career, he pursued a range of social reforms that reflected his liberal values. As Attorney-General in the early 1880s, he introduced the Married Women's Property Act and a number of other legal reform initiatives. Later, in the Federal Parliament, he opposed the White Australia policy. He was twice Premier of South Australia and then left the State Parliament in 1901 when he was elected as one of the first South Australian senators in the Federal Parliament. He served one term as a senator and in 1905 was elected to the South Australian Legislative Council, where he served until his death in 1915. Beyond these public offices, Sir John also played a major role in the debates and various federal constitutional conventions that took place throughout the 1890s. Together with Edmund Barton and Richard O'Connor, he was responsible for drafting the Australian Constitution during the 1897-98 convention here in Adelaide. Over a century on, this is now a watershed time within Australia's political landscape, and our higher education sector is facing the opportunity of unprecedented reform. The current focus on our universities and their role in the future of the nation is creating, as you know, considerable and robust debate. So this is a special event in our calendar, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome back to the campus the Honourable Tony Abbott, who gave a lecture here last 12 years ago. But I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've had a serving Prime Minister here, or certainly for a very, very long time. I'm sure tonight's oration will offer new insights into critical policy questions that are dominating the public consciousness at the moment. And I'm very glad that education and the future of our universities is one of those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the second Sir John Downer Oration. The first lecture in this series was given nearly 2 years ago by the former Prime Minister, John Howard. And when the idea of an oration to honour the contribution of Sir John Downer to South Australian and national politics was first proposed, the University was very enthusiastic and agreed that we should invite contributions from distinguished and significant political figures. There is no doubt that with lectures from Mr Howard in 2012 and tonight from the current Prime Minister, we have met that expectation. The Vice-Chancellor's outlined the significant contribution to South Australian national politics made by Sir John Downer. There can be no better honour, I think, than to have the Prime Minister of Australia here to celebrate Sir John's achievements. The Honourable Tony Abbott, my apologies, the Honourable Tony Abbott MP is the 28th Prime Minister of Australia and has served in that office since September last year. His election as Prime Minister followed nearly 20 years' service as a member of the Federal Parliament. He was first elected in 1994 at a by-election for the division of Warringah. He was appointed as Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and Small Business in 1998, before becoming Minister for Health and Ageing in 2003. He was elected by his party as Leader of the Opposition just over 2 years after the election of the Rudd government, and he led the coalition to the elections of 2010 and 2013. Throughout his political career, Mr Abbott has been clear-minded about the importance and the value of service to the public as a politician and about the appropriate role of government in Australia's democratic framework. He has championed causes such as Indigenous affairs and has been at the forefront of numerous debates on reforms in a wide range of social and economic policy areas. In his writings and public comments, he's also taken a lead role in debates over Australia's constitutional arrangements. Many of these, of course, are similar to the issues that occupied Sir John Downer over a century ago. And importantly for us, it's one of the many reasons why Mr Abbott is so well suited to give this lecture. I now invite the Prime Minister, Mr Tony Abbott, to deliver the second Sir John Downer Oration.
Deputy Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, parliamentary colleagues, particularly Senators Birmingham, Fawcett and Edwards and Dr Andrew Southcott, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honour to be here tonight to be this year's Sir John Downer Lecturer. Sir John, as we've just been reminded, was a Premier of South Australia and a delegate to the colonial conferences that produced the constitution of this Commonwealth. Australians' reluctance to support referenda that changed the Constitution testifies to the strength of the system of government that Sir John helped to shape. It's a constitution that gives people their due by keeping government in check. Sir John described himself as a Tory. He was a genial, humane Conservative who sought to extend traditional rights and privileges as widely as possible. His was, if I may say so, the conservatism of this university, his alma mater, which was the first Australian university to admit women, offer degrees in science and in music, and elect a woman to its governing body. Sir John was a supporter of female property rights and intervened to ensure that the new Commonwealth Constitution did not disenfranchise Aboriginal people who could vote in South Australia from voting in federal elections too. He championed the interests of South Australia, but was not a provincialist. He was an Australian patriot, but understood the ties of history, kinship, trade and affection between Australia and the United Kingdom. He also helped to establish a dynasty that has made an enduring contribution to the country he helped to found. His son, Sir Alexander Downer, was one of our longest-serving immigration ministers. His grandson, also Alexander Downer, was our longest-serving foreign minister and is now, of course, as his father was before him, our High Commissioner in London. Great things are not usually achieved by people of small ambition. Successive generations of Downers didn't underestimate themselves or the country they served, and neither should we. That's my theme for this lecture. Don't underestimate Australia. We count for more than Australians are often inclined to think. We shouldn't imagine that we can readily change the world on our own, but neither should we doubt the difference we can make. After all, we are the world's 12th largest economy, have the world's 5th most traded currency, and are home to 4 of the world's 11 top-rated banks. We're the world's largest exporter of metallurgical coal and iron ore, and will soon be the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. Around the world, we have many friends and few critics. We're big enough to be useful, but not so big that we're intimidating. Throughout our history, we've been an utterly dependable ally, a reliable trading partner, and a swift responder to people in need. It's often forgotten that the Australian Army was a central part of the battles that decided World War I. Our exploits on the Western Front are much better remembered in France than in Australia. Australian soldiers captured Jerusalem and Damascus as part of General Allenby's army. The centenary commemorations that started this week with the 100th anniversary of the expedition to German New Guinea should remind us that Gallipoli was not even the beginning, let alone the end, of Australians' part in the Great War. When President Wilson chipped Prime Minister Hughes at the Versailles Conference, the Australian reminded the American that he was speaking on behalf of 60,000 dead. A generation later, the Australian 7th Division helped to capture Syria from the Vichy French, and the 9th Division had a decisive role in the Battle of El Alamein. And then, under the Colombo Plan, many of the leaders of post-war Southeast Asia were educated at Australian universities. Sir Robert Menzies was the chief British negotiator after the Suez Crisis. John Howard and Alexander Downer put together the UN Security Council resolution and dispatched the force that gave East Timor its freedom. With the assistance of New Zealand, the Howard government assembled the police and military team that stabilised the Solomon Islands. Australia was the first to help Indonesia after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and among the first to help Japan after their earthquake and the Philippines after their typhoon. And we're still scouring the deep ocean off Western Australia for the wreck of flight MH370. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop has rightly been praised for the Security Council resolution on the MH17 atrocity. But the government's work here merely renewed a long tradition of effective diplomacy, including, to give credit where it's due, Doc Evertt's work at the San Francisco conference which set up the United Nations. It's true that Australia is not a dominant power, except perhaps in the South Pacific. Still, we are a country with global interests and with some global reach. Just last week, for instance, a Royal Australian Air Force Hercules joined American and British planes in the humanitarian airdrop on Iraq's Mount Sinjar. Last month, Australia was able swiftly to deploy 200 police and more than 250 military personnel to Europe to support Operation Bring Them Home. As our record shows, Australia has long been prepared to play our part in the world's struggles. We will do what we reasonably and prudently can to advance our interests, protect our citizens, and uphold our values. We will do what we reasonably and prudently can to encourage American leadership, because that's provided the global security and stability that's allowed Japan, Korea, China, and India to achieve the greatest and swiftest advances in material welfare in human history. Now, Australia needs to manage three overlapping foreign policy imperatives: to maintain stability and prosperity in our neighbourhood, to promote trade and investment, particularly with North Asia, where our biggest economic partners are, and to help preserve global security in conjunction with like-minded countries. Since last year's election, I've travelled in this order to Indonesia and PNG to keep regional relationships in good repair, to Japan, Korea and China to boost trade, and to the United States, Canada and now Britain to deepen security and intelligence cooperation. We are about to conclude a joint understanding on intelligence cooperation that should fully restore the trusted partnership with Indonesia that had been unsettled by the Snowden allegations. we are continuing to work with PNG on measures to boost development and improve public safety. Comprehensive free trade agreements have been concluded with Korea and Japan and are well advanced with China. Australia's consistent message is that the countries of our region will all advance together, or none of us will advance at all, because the consequences of serious conflict would be catastrophic. One reason for guarded confidence that the territorial disputes in our region will in fact ultimately be settled peacefully and in accordance with international law is the cost to everyone of the alternative. It was John Howard who used to say that Australia didn't have to choose between our history and our geography. In like vein, this government has pointed out that you don't win new friends by losing old ones, and you don't make some friendships stronger by weakening others. So far, by focusing on areas of mutual interest and common values, we've managed to strengthen all our relationships. By being clear about where we stand, while respectful towards others' perspectives, there's every chance that we can continue to make a constructive contribution to world affairs. We are ready to continue our existing training-focused military contribution to Afghanistan in partnership with our allies and under the right legal framework. This should help to preserve the gains so painfully made at such cost to so many countries since the fall of the Taliban. We are ready to continue humanitarian involvement in the Middle East, particularly Iraq, where Australian troops tried to help build a more civil society after the fall of Saddam Hussein. There would have to be a clear and achievable overall purpose, a clear and proportionate role for us, a careful assessment of the risks, and an overall humanitarian purpose. We are talking to our partners about how we might contribute to international efforts to protect people against the advances of ISIL terrorists. I should point out, though, that there is a world of difference between attempting to create a new polity and a new society and helping to prevent the slaughter of innocents at the request of the existing government. Let's be under no illusions. The geopolitics of the Middle East is a witch's brew of complexity and danger. It's much more often a case of choosing the least evil rather than the greatest good. Still, watching preventable genocide is not a credible option either. President Obama has wisely resisted taking sides in Iraq's numerous conflicts, but is prepared to help a credible government and is ready to protect innocent people, and in proportionate ways, Australia too should be prepared to help where we reasonably and prudently can. Consolidation of ISIL rule in eastern Syria and in western and northern Iraq would be a disaster for the wider world, as well as a humanitarian catastrophe in the region. The declaration of a caliphate shows ISIL's ambition for universal dominion and claims to the allegiance of Muslims everywhere. It's natural to scoff at such medieval aspirations, but ISIL takes them seriously and has been disconcertingly successful against the Iraqi army. Entrenched as a terrorist state in parts of Iraq and Syria, ISIL could do at least as much damage to the wider world as the Taliban did from Afghanistan and export at least as much terrorism. Peaceful, pluralist democracies naturally shrink from reaching out to such conflicts, but these conflicts, alas, reach out to us. The ISIL eruption in Syria and Iraq, along with the parallel growth of al-Nusra and the appearance of al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa and Boko Haram in Central Africa, are grounds for profound concern, but not despair. Not all the signs are bad. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey that might once have been ambivalent towards extremist movements are now deeply alarmed. Some Muslim countries are even prepared to cooperate with Israel against terrorist movements whose immediate enemy are moderate Muslim governments. After all, ISIL threatens all countries and all peoples who don't share its particular brand of extremism. Energised and augmented, terrorist networks are once more planning attacks against Western targets. Thanks to the many hundreds of Westerners fighting with ISIL and al-Nusra, including at least 60 Australian fighters and about 100 facilitators, there are now more homegrown terrorists or potential terrorists than ever before. Australia is boosting border security with biometric screening to be installed at airports and increased funding for security agencies. New laws against unjustified travel to designated terrorist hotspots will make it much easier to arrest and jail returning fighters. Laws requiring the retention and availability of limited telecommunications records will maintain our ability to monitor terrorist plotting and prevent terrorist crime. As well, the government is reassuring Australian Muslims that our concern is to prevent terrorist crime, not to single out any particular community. Extremism is the enemy, not Islam. Terrorism is being targeted, not the members of any religion. Terrorists' tendency to justify themselves in religious terms could lead Muslims to rethink and re-articulate the real nature of their faith. From the Saudi king to the President of Indonesia, Muslim leaders are categorically affirming that the slaughter of innocents is always a crime in the eyes of God. Paradoxically, the growth of religiously inspired terrorism may spur mainstream Islam to become even more attuned to individuals' rights. Certainly, there has been no shortage of Australian Muslims ready to condemn ISIL and its killings. Samir Dandan, the president of the Lebanese Muslim Association, to take just one of many examples, said that he found such acts utterly repugnant, both as a Muslim and a human being. While some of the Islamic leaders who have met recently with the government claim that we too readily justify Israel, none have tried to defend ISIL. Perhaps this will turn out to be the moment when Australians come to appreciate that the Muslims among us are much more often have our perspectives than those of the protagonists in foreign wars. Perhaps this might turn out to be the time when Islam, like Christianity before it, finally dissociates religion from the use of force. The alternative, deepening religious divisions between well-armed states locked in existential conflict, should be too horrible to contemplate. Certainly, Australia has long been an exemplar of how people of different faiths and cultures can not only live harmoniously together, but find unity in diversity. Migrants from the four corners of the earth have come to this country not to change us, but to join us. They have all voted with their feet for Australia. No one has been expected to abandon their heritage or conform to any particular ideal of Australianness. Multiculturalism has turned out to mean people becoming Australian, joining our team, if you like, in their own way and at their own pace. One of the participants in my Muslim leaders' roundtables this week rather exuberantly declared, "We are all part of Team Australia, and you are our captain," suggesting that he had yet to assimilate Australians' habitual scepticism towards their politicians. In our own way, Australia has long sought to showcase this easygoing approach to cultural and religious differences. 60 years ago, with the Colombo Plan, the future leaders of the subcontinent and Southeast Asia began coming here to study at Australian universities. More recently, this has become a massive export education industry focused on our region. Some of these students have so appreciated their Australian experiences that they have built a life for themselves here. The vast majority return home as fans of Australia. Two presidents, in fact, of Singapore and the Chief Minister of Sarawak, for instance, are alumni of this university. Providing an Australian education has not only been of benefit to the overseas individuals and the local institutions concerned, but it's become a very effective exercise in soft power. It's become a form of advertisement for Australia, our opportunities, our values, and our way of life. So this government has recently begun the new Colombo Plan, which will complement the hundreds of thousands of overseas students in Australia with tens of thousands of Australian students overseas, mostly in our region. The new Colombo Plan is already underway, with hundreds of Australians now studying as awardees and scholars in Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong and Indonesia. As part of their award, new Colombo Plan students will work as interns in overseas businesses and institutions. Now, partly, this is overdue acknowledgement that the countries of our region have as much to teach us as we have to teach them. Partly, it's an opportunity for bright young Australians to be ambassadors for their country amongst their regional peers. It will be a learning experience for everyone. Plainly, Australians will come home with a better understanding of the languages and cultures of Asia. Over time, I suspect, a greater Australian presence will reinforce our region's existing and increasing attachment to democracy, the rule of law, pluralism, and individual rights and responsibilities. Our regional partners are likely to become freer societies as well as stronger economies. Australia's international engagements have rarely been so multifaceted. As well as our security, trade and cultural relationships, there's also the multinational economic and financial policy networks associated with Australia's presidency of the world's top economic forum, the G20. A richer world is likely to be a safer and more secure world because there's scarcely any problem that couldn't use more resources to address it. The G20 countries have already agreed to the target of an extra 2% in global growth above business as usual over the next 5 years. This is to be achieved through more trade, less regulation, and more opportunities for private business. Australia is seeking to lead by example by new free trade agreements, by abolishing useless hits to our standard of living and jobs like the carbon tax and the mining tax, by cutting red tape, by getting the budget under control, and at the same time by boosting economic infrastructure. We are reducing spending on short-term consumption so we can increase it on long-term investment. We're aiming to build a consensus in favour of private sector-led growth. And if there is a renewed global effort towards stronger international tax rules, more representative economic governance and freer trade, it will be, in part, the result of Australia's consistent G20 diplomacy. The first requirement of leadership, after all, is knowing what you want to achieve. From negotiating free trade agreements, to Operation Sovereign Borders, to Operation Bring Them Home, and indeed to Operation Budget Repair, there has been a clarity of purpose to all this government has been trying to achieve. Internationally, at least, there has been a measure of recognition for this. We can and are making a difference. At the height of the international search for missing flight MH370, I went to Pearce Air Base to thank the personnel involved from Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia and the United States, and also from China, Japan and Korea. It was a fine and fragrant example of international cooperation in a very good cause. Anticipating my North Asia trip, I sought a photo with the Japanese, Korean and Chinese aircrew, and sensing the reluctance of the Chinese and Japanese to be too close together, stood between them with my arms firmly on their shoulders. A few weeks later, US, Chinese and Japanese ambassadors sat next to each other on the floor of the Australian Parliament to listen to Treasurer Joe Hockey's budget. It would be presumptuous to declare only in Australia. Still, these are small but significant straws in the wind for what might be achieved with sustained effort, constant goodwill and a consistent point of view. Our characteristics as a nation reflect our characteristics as a people. We are instinctively neighbourly. We judge people by their actions. We respond to events and needs in a way that's practical and effective. We're among the first to lend a hand and the last to say enough. We don't dwell on past enmities, and once a fight is over, strive to turn friends into enemies into friends. Thinking about the New South Wales Liberal Party for a moment there. Keeping commitments, valuing human life and extending freedom are universal aspirations, not just Australian ones, and where those values prevail, the world is safer for everyone. So that's our objective, a stronger Australia in a safer world, and our determination as a government is to work purposefully and consistently to bring it about. So, Vice-Chancellor, thank you so much. Members of the Downer family, thank you so much. It is a tremendous honour to be the second Sir John Downer Lecturer. I am very conscious of the fact that we members of Parliament do not walk alone. We walk in the footsteps of everyone who has gone before us, and it's good to be enriched and invigorated by their experience and their example. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'll now ask Edward Downer to come forward and on behalf of the Downer family and the whole audience, offer thanks for the lecture. Edward.
Prime Minister, Vice-Chancellor and fellow guests, I am Sir John Downer's great-grandson, and on behalf of my fellow descendants, thank you all very much for coming. Sir John Downer led a political life which is a little far removed from that of current-day politicians. In his biography of Sir John, former South Australian Premier John Bannon described him as an enigma. Many of Sir John's interactions with politics would be quite astonishing if they were repeated today, and perhaps the most inauspicious was in 1887 when he was returning from the First Imperial Conference in London. Having just been knighted at the age of 42 by Queen Victoria and on board the ship returning home to Adelaide, he was voted out as Premier whilst in transit. Prime Minister, despite the wishes of some of your admirers outside, I trust you'll not suffer a similar fate on your flight back to Canberra. I was of course drawn to mention Sir John's career as the Prime Minister's address has been made in his memory, and Mr Bannon's biography of Sir John is entitled The Supreme Federalist. It touches on Sir John's participation in the constitutional conventions and his role as a key draftsman of the Constitution. On reading it, it is perhaps enlightening to see that the challenges of federation in the late 19th century echo with many of those with which we grapple today. While my family has immense pride in Sir John's work, the continuation of those challenges beyond 114 years highlights the need, of course, to continually consider reform of Australia's federation. The Prime Minister's released terms of reference for a white paper on the reform of the Federation, which is due at the end of 2015. Now, despite the usual temptation to provide an Adelaide Crows scarf, a slab of Coopers, or perhaps even a frog cake, it does seem appropriate to provide the Prime Minister with a small amount of inspiration or historical lessons to the extent I'm able to do so, and I thought it might be appropriate to provide a copy of Mr Bannon's biography of Sir John. So on behalf of my family, I thank the Prime Minister for his address and wish him well for his reform of the Federation.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you again, Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the oration and events for this evening. Can I thank you all again for coming and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Good night.